One pain, one truth.
I set the pen down the moment my fingertips touched it. My hand was so cold I thought I'd just picked up a block of ice. In front of me was a transfer agreement, and behind the register, my father was staring at his feet instead of looking at me. It was my 18th birthday, and I was about to decide whether or not to sell off my entire childhood. Just a few hours earlier, everything had still looked like a normal birthday party. I was cutting my cake inside our bookstore, when my dad's phone rang for the third time in less than 10 minutes. He glanced at the screen and declined the call almost automatically, but I caught the name before it disappeared. Hudson Capital. Uncle Ray, who was standing near the register, immediately pulled Dad toward the front window and whispered something in his ear. They spoke so fast I couldn't catch all of it, while my mother kept pouring coffee for customers as if nothing was happening. The only problem was that her hands were shaking so badly she spilled coffee onto the tablecloth. Our bookstore was called Lantern Books. It sat in an old neighborhood near the train station. The walls used to be yellow. Now they were just some tired color that didn't even have a name anymore. The wooden stairs creaked loudly enough to wake the whole house at night, and every winter the wind slipped through the cracks in the door and stung your face. People walking by saw something charming, something worth photographing and posting online with a caption about slowing down. My family saw overdue utility bills, a leaking roof, and a loan that probably would never be paid off. Dad called me behind the counter. After everyone leaves, he said quietly, "I need you to sign a few things." Sign what? He avoided my eyes. Just paperwork for renovations. Uncle Ray jumped in before I could ask another question. Once this goes through, we can finally breathe again. Dad's phone vibrated once more. This time he didn't even look at it. He stood still for a few seconds and slipped it back into his shirt pocket. I watched how hard he was trying to act normal, and I knew immediately that nothing about tonight was going to be normal. I used to think the bookstore was just a bookstore until I was 13. That was the year I ran away from home after a brutal argument with my mother. It was raining so hard the streets looked flooded. Dad spent hours driving around looking for me, and on the way home, a truck slammed directly into the driver's side of his car. His left leg never healed properly. He never went back to his old printing job either. Nobody in the family ever said it out loud, but I always knew that was the moment everything started falling apart. After the accident, my grandfather handed the bookstore over to Dad to manage. But the person most attached to the place was actually me. In middle school, I practically lived in the storage room in the basement. Anytime I felt like I'd disappointed someone, I hid down there. Once, after Mom yelled at me for losing the electric bill, I sat in the basement almost until morning. Dad found me. He didn't scold me. He didn't ask questions. He just handed me a still warm sandwich and sat beside me. Maybe that's why every time someone talked about turning the bookstore into some trendy cafe, my chest tightened, like someone was trying to bulldoze the last safe place I had left. My grandfather died when I was 15. At the funeral, I clearly remember seeing Uncle Ray standing on the porch talking to a commercial real estate agent. I even remember exactly what he said. If this neighborhood gets redeveloped the right way, this place could make some real money. At the time, I thought he was being insensitive. I had no idea things had already started back then. 3 months before my 18th birthday, Evelyn asked me to go down to the basement and bring up some old accounting ledgers. She had managed the bookstore's finances since before they even changed the sign out front. She was nearly 60 and always spoke as if someone might be listening. That day, she shut the basement door before handing me a cardboard box tied with rubber bands. "Your grandfather told me not to give this to you until you turned 18. Inside were ownership documents for the bookstore, notarized papers, and an old blue cloth-bound notebook I'd seen Grandpa writing in every night. I was still trying to understand what I was holding when she continued. Your father knows the store can't legally be sold without your signature. I looked up immediately. Why would it need my signature? She lowered her glasses. Your grandfather transferred part ownership to you when you were 14. My hands went ice cold. Dad knows that? She nodded. He knows you own a share. She paused. But I don't think he knows your grandfather left the final decision to you. I stared at the stack of papers in my lap, my head buzzing. Then the blue notebook fell open to the very last page. One sentence had been underlined twice. If you choose to leave this place, make sure you're not just running away from yourself. From that day on, I started noticing everything. Dad talked about money more than he used to. Mom stayed up late with a calculator. One night around 1 a.m, I went downstairs for water and found Mom taking off her wedding ring and setting it on the table. Maybe we should sell it, she whispered. Dad sat there for a long time before answering. Your father would crawl out of his grave and kill me. But he laughed when he said it. The kind of laugh people make when they've run out of options. About a month later, Uncle Ray started bringing contracts to the house nonstop. He talked as if he were the only person trying to save the family. If we sign before the end of the year, they'll hold that price. A place like this can't survive anymore. Nostalgia doesn't pay the electric bill. Sometimes I thought he was right. Other times I wanted to throw the entire stack of papers out the window. One night at dinner, Dad suddenly asked me about college. I said I'd probably stay close to home because it was cheaper. Mom stayed quiet. Then Uncle Ray immediately said, if this deal goes through, tuition won't even be a problem. The mood at the table changed instantly. I set my chopsticks down. Can everyone stop talking like I'm holding the family hostage? Silence. Dad looked at me for a long time. Nobody's saying that. But that night I heard him arguing with Mom in the kitchen. You're putting too much pressure on her. Then what do you want me to do? Dad snapped back. Sit here and wait for the bank to take the house? I lay in bed listening through the thin walls, feeling like someone had set a brick on my chest. 2 weeks before my birthday, Natalie stopped by the store. She used to work there during college and was also the person who once told me the bookstore smelled like memories. That evening she stood looking at the shelves for a long time before quietly saying, honestly, renovating it might not be the worst thing. I looked at her like she'd lost her mind. She avoided my eyes. Your dad's exhausted, Claire. That night I sat alone in the basement, and for the first time, I seriously thought maybe I should just sign and get it over with. But a few days later, I overheard Uncle Ray talking to Dad in the back storage room. She still feels guilty about your accident, he said quietly. Eventually she'll sign. I froze outside the door. Dad didn't argue. He just said softly, don't push her too hard. That was all. But my entire body went cold. And then my birthday arrived. The bookstore was packed. Regular customers from the neighborhood. People who had been buying books there since my grandfather was alive. Some brought homemade apple pie. Some brought cheap wine. From the outside, we probably looked like one of those warm families from holiday movies. Only I knew Dad's phone was still vibrating nonstop in his pocket, and the transfer agreement was sitting beneath the register, waiting. Around 9 o'clock, Uncle Ray pulled me behind the counter, slid a pen toward me, and lowered his voice. They're waiting for a final answer. I looked down at the contract. If I signed, the bookstore would be demolished and rebuilt into a sleek commercial space. The old wooden counter would be gone. The basement storage room would become a walk-in cooler for a cafe. I could hear my blood rushing in my ears. Dad stood a few feet away, looking at me, then down at his feet. Claire, he said softly. I don't want to pressure you. But he stayed there, waiting for me to sign. I picked up the pen. Then I set it back down. My hand was frozen stiff. Outside, people were still laughing and talking. The bell above the door still rang every time someone walked in. An older customer was telling someone about bringing his daughter here to buy comic books years ago. Mom smiled at him, but her eyes kept drifting toward the counter. Uncle Ray pushed the contract closer to me. If we close tonight, they'll hold that price. I looked up. What happens if I don't sign? He let out a sharp breath through his nose. Then we lose this opportunity. Do we lose the store too? A tiny silence followed. Not right away. I turned to Dad immediately. He looked away. And strangely, that was the moment I became truly afraid. For months everyone had acted as though if I didn't sign, the family would collapse overnight. But I suddenly realized something. We were struggling. Really struggling. But this wasn't some final lifeboat where my signature was the only thing keeping us alive. Everyone was just desperate enough to cling to it. Right then, my little brother Ethan came running downstairs holding a soda can. He looked at the contract. Are they keeping the basement? Nobody answered. Ethan looked around awkwardly. I was just asking. I looked at him, my throat tightening. He had grown up in this bookstore too. After most of the guests left, I said I needed some air. Dad didn't stop me. He simply sat down beside the counter and took a pain pill from his pocket. I stood on the sidewalk and looked through the front window. Dad was rubbing his left leg gently, as if he thought nobody could see. I hated myself for how I felt in that moment. Part of me wanted to sign immediately so he wouldn't have to suffer anymore. Another part of me was furious that this pressure had been hanging over me for months. I walked around behind the building and sat on the back steps for nearly half an hour. Then my phone vibrated. Natalie. Have you signed yet? No, a pause. Listen, the other day, when I said selling might be better. I only said that because I thought it would take some pressure off your dad. I let out a dry laugh. Everybody thinks that. She sighed. But after your dad's accident, he actually tried to sell the bookstore once. I froze. What? Your grandfather was furious, she said quietly. He told him that if he sold it, the family wouldn't have anywhere left to come home to. I stood in the dark alley behind the store, completely numb. I had never heard that story before. When I went back inside, Uncle Ray was standing near the door shouting into his phone. I already told you, she'll sign. The moment he saw me, he hung up. He was running out of patience. Claire, let me be honest. They're opening 2 more locations around this neighborhood. If we don't move fast, they'll walk away. I looked at him. How much do you get if this deal goes through? He froze. Dad immediately looked up. Uncle Ray forced a smile. Everybody gets something from a deal. How much? Nobody answered. I turned toward Dad. Did you know about this? Dad rubbed both hands over his face. Claire, I don't know why I said what came out next. Maybe I was exhausted. Maybe for the first time, this no longer felt like it was only about saving the family. If you hadn't gone looking for me that night, maybe we wouldn't be in this mess. The instant the words left my mouth, I wanted to take them back. The entire store fell silent. Mom stood frozen by the counter, still holding a stack of glasses. Ethan stopped halfway down the stairs. And Dad just sat there as if someone had punched him directly in the chest. I had never seen his face look like that before. Not angry. Just completely empty. I went straight upstairs, locked my bedroom door, and slid to the floor because my legs wouldn't hold me up anymore. I could hear Uncle Ray saying something downstairs, the front door slamming shut, my parents arguing quietly. But eventually it all blurred together. Close to midnight, someone knocked on my door. I thought it was Mom. It was Dad. He stood outside for a long time before speaking. "I'm not angry at you." I stayed silent in the dark. Then he said softly, "There's something I've never told you." I still didn't answer. "The night of the accident," he stopped for a few seconds. "I already knew you were hiding in the basement." I sat upright immediately. "Your mother panicked. That's the only reason I drove around looking for you." My throat tightened. Dad leaned against the door from the other side. "Back then, I remember thinking, if there's still a place you run to whenever you feel awful about yourself," he gave a tired little laugh. "Then maybe everything isn't completely broken yet." I bit my lip until it hurt. "Then why did you let me believe all these years that it was my fault?" Silence. A very long silence. Then finally, "Because sometimes," his voice nearly disappeared. "Sometimes I really was angry at you. That was what made me cry. Not because he was cruel, but because it was the most honest thing he had ever said to me." The next morning I didn't come downstairs. I stayed in bed until almost noon, listening to people moving through the bookstore below. Sometimes I heard Uncle Ray. Sometimes I heard Mom talking on the phone about medication costs. Sometimes the receipt printer downstairs buzzed for a few seconds and went quiet again. Around 1 in the afternoon, Ethan pushed open my bedroom door, set a box of donuts on the desk, and dropped onto the floor. "Dad didn't eat breakfast." I didn't answer. Ethan opened the box, took a bite, then continued as if he were talking about some other family. "Uncle Ray's been yelling downstairs all morning." I stayed quiet. "He says if you don't sign, we lose everything." I laughed hollowly. Everybody really loves saying that. Ethan sat there watching me for a while. Then he asked softly, "Do you hate Dad?" I almost answered immediately. But I couldn't. Because the truth was, I didn't know. That afternoon I came downstairs for the first time since the argument. The bookstore was nearly empty. The sky outside was gray, and the yellow lights inside made everything look older than usual. Dad sat behind the counter staring at a pile of bills. He looked up when he saw me but said nothing. I grabbed a soda from the refrigerator. When I closed the door, I noticed an overdue electric bill on the counter. 11 days late. There was even a coffee stain on one corner. I stared at it a little too long. Dad quickly folded the papers closed. "Don't." I immediately looked away. That night Mom got home late from the pharmacy. She walked past me in the kitchen, grabbed a bottle of headache medicine from the cabinet, and while pouring herself water suddenly asked, "Do you think I'm selfish?" I looked at her, confused. Mom smiled faintly. "When your father and I first got married, I hated this bookstore." I had never heard her say that before. "Every time I came here, your father turned into a different person." She leaned against the sink. "Your grandfather talked about books with customers all day long. Sometimes I felt invisible." She smiled again, but her eyes were red. "Sometimes I honestly felt like I married into a family that loved something else more than they loved me." I stared at her for a long moment. "Then why did you stay?" Mom fell silent. "Because of your father." Her voice almost disappeared when she said it. "He loved this place too much." And for the first time, I realized Mom didn't want to sell the bookstore only because of money. Part of her wanted to beat it. Wanted it to stop standing between the people in this family. 2 days later, the investors sent their final ultimatum. Sign by Friday, or they walk. Uncle Ray nearly lost control after that. He was constantly at the store, taking calls behind the counter, pacing nonstop. One time I overheard him say, "She's just dragging this out because she wants attention." Dad avoided looking me in the eye more and more. And honestly, I was getting worse too. I deliberately came to dinner late. Deliberately stayed silent when Dad tried talking to me. One evening he asked me to pick up his pain medication from the pharmacy. I heard him clearly but pretended I hadn't. By the time I finally handed him the medication, I hated myself enough to feel sick. And then I did it again later. Thursday night, one day before the deadline, Uncle Ray brought someone else to the bookstore. A man in a black jacket with slicked back hair who introduced himself as a project manager. He walked around the store as if he were touring an abandoned lot. If we knock down this back wall, the space will really open up. Keeping the old sign out front could attract customers. The basement could become a live music venue. I stood near the stairs listening to him, my hands getting colder by the minute. The man never looked at a single book. At one point he accidentally knocked an entire stack of paperbacks onto the floor. Nobody rushed to pick them up. Dad just stared at them for a long time. After he left, the store fell completely quiet. Rain began tapping against the front windows. Uncle Ray immediately turned toward me. Well? His patience was gone. Now you can see they're serious. I looked back at him. What about you? What? Are you serious about helping this family? I said softly. We're serious about your investment? His face immediately turned red. You think I'm getting rich off this place? I don't know, I said. But apparently enough to keep you on the phone all week. He slammed his hand down on the counter. At least I'm doing something. Suddenly Dad stood up so fast the entire family jumped. Enough. The whole store went silent. It was the first time he had raised his voice through any of this. Uncle Ray stared at him for a few seconds and then gave a bitter laugh. You think keeping this place is magically going to fix everything? Dad didn't answer. Uncle Ray looked at me one last time. Someday you'll understand. Memories don't pay the rent. Then he walked out. The door slammed so hard the bell above it rattled for a long time. Dad slowly sat back down. I could see his leg trembling slightly beneath the counter. After a long silence, he finally spoke. Your uncle isn't completely wrong. I didn't answer. Dad smiled tiredly. When I was your age, I wanted to get away from this place too. I looked at him. Your grandfather made me work here almost every day. He gently ran his hand across the old wooden countertop. I hated the smell of dusty paper. Hated customers asking stupid questions. Hated feeling like my entire life was trapped inside this building. He fell silent for a moment. After the accident, he finally said, I started understanding why your grandfather fought so hard to keep it. I looked down at the stack of books beneath the counter. Dad took a slow breath. But understanding something doesn't mean you can save it. That hit me directly, and my throat closed up instantly. I sat down across from him. For a long time neither of us said anything. Then finally I asked, if I don't sign, will you be angry with me forever? Dad gave a weak laugh. Next month's electric bill is due, and I still have no idea how I'm going to pay it. He shook his head. I don't have the energy to stay angry forever. I bit my lip and looked away. Then finally I said, I don't want to sell it. Dad nodded very slowly. Not shocked. Not devastated. Just like someone hearing the thing he already knew was coming. He reached into his shirt pocket, took out the bookstore keys, and placed them on the counter between us. Tomorrow I'll go talk to the bank. I looked at the key ring. I didn't touch it. Dad didn't push it toward me either. He stood up and started toward the stairs, then stopped halfway there. Oh. I looked up. He still didn't turn around. The night of the accident, his voice grew quieter. I remember thinking for a moment that maybe everyone would be better off if I hadn't gone looking for you. Everything inside me stopped. But before I could say anything, he continued. Then right after that. I remember feeling relieved that I did. Then he went upstairs, leaving me alone in the dark bookstore. Rain still fell softly against the windows. I sat there for a long time without turning on the lights, staring at the keys lying on the old wooden counter. And for the first time since all of this began, I wasn't sure I had actually managed to save anything at all. Some things said in our most painful moments stay with us long after the moment itself has passed. And Claire isn't the only person who has ever felt like they were carrying the emotional weight of an entire family on their shoulders. If you were in Claire's position, would you have signed that contract? Leave a comment, because I think everyone will see this story a little differently.